Good morning, and welcome to the second of SPG's two-part webinar series on alternative pulse crops. My name is Mark Satilny, and I'm going to be hosting our discussion today. For those of you who are joining us live, if you provided a CCA number at the time of registration, SPG will be applying for CEUs on your behalf. That will all be taken care of. Today, we'll also be using Slido. So if you haven't used this before, it's really easy to set up, and you just go onto the internet, go to slido.com. Our event code for today is 1176581. And through this, you'll then be able to join the event and ask questions or participate in any live polls that we have going on. At the end of each of the two crops that I'll be covering today, the faba beans and soybeans, we will do a live question and answer discussion period. So if you have any questions, you can just enter it into that Q&A tab in Slido, and I will answer them to the best of my ability or point you in the right direction. So as I said, I am Mark Satilny. I'm an agronomy manager with SPG, along with my colleague Mike Brown. If any of you were on the presentation yesterday, you'll have seen him presenting on the dry beans and chickpeas. Primarily, we kind of focus on different areas of the province and different crops. So for me, I focus on pea, faba bean, and soybean, which mainly takes me kind of to the north and east of the province. Mike is focusing on lentil, chickpeas, and dry beans, which typically takes him more to the south and the west of the province, but obviously kind of with different environmental conditions and soil zones, we kind of intermingle in all of those. But if you ever have any questions relating to any of those kind of crops, then definitely reach out to us, and we are here to help you with that. So for today, first I'm going to start with faba beans. So I'll be talking about the growing areas, production, and kind of yields that we've seen in the last few years. Then I'll delve into a bit of the agronomic aspects of growing faba beans, variety selection, seeding, field management, any issues that might kind of come up in the year, harvest considerations to look out for, and then finally markets and end uses for why you should also be growing these crops. So as for where faba beans have been grown so far in the province, so typically they are best suited to the black and dark gray soil zones. As you can see in this map here, a lot of the growing area is kind of concentrated up in the north there. Tisdale, northeast, has a lot of acres of faba beans, and North Battleford and northwest of that is kind of the other big hotspot of the area. It really does tend to focus in on those dark brown, black and dark gray soil zones. As for the actual acres that we have seeded in the province and in the country and how we kind of compare with that, so you can see here, faba beans in Saskatchewan account for about 33% of all of the faba beans grown in the country, with 26,400 acres. This is kind of one of the big areas that it is produced, with Alberta then making up the remainder, primarily because they have such a large feed market for their livestock that they then are growing that other big proportion of faba beans. Here, just kind of narrowing it down a bit to just Saskatchewan. So you can see again that 26,400 acres. We did decrease 10,000-ish acres from 2023. So in 2023, there was 37,000 acres. Manitoba hasn't really done anything for the last couple years up until 2024, where they just kind of had 1.5 thousand acres. But Alberta, as I was saying, did increase from 47 47.3 thousand to 48.6. So they continued to go up. We went down a bit this last year, and hopefully we'll see kind of a shift there going forward. Here is looking at some faba bean production in the 1,000 ton, just kind of going overall. You can see we have had pretty stable amounts of production in the last few years. Obviously, there was that big hit when we got very much drought conditions, but we have been slowly recovering. And with even those fewer acres, we didn't really see too much of a decrease in the actual production of the crop, mainly because varieties continue to get better and we're really able to kind of get the most yield out of the crops that we are growing. So that was just kind of a very quick overview of the crop in the province for the last few years. Now we'll kind of get down into actually growing it and how to manage it in your crop rotation. So this is just a general kind of overview of faba beans. They are very much best adapted to kind of those moister, cooler areas, which is why they are grown. Pretty much majority is north of Saskatoon, where there are those just heavier, wetter soils, get more precipitation. They are a bit of a longer maturing crop, so they do take a bit to get to harvest time, but they really do thrive in those wet conditions. One of the really good benefits about growing faba beans is that resistance to Aphanomyces infection. So if you have typically been growing peas a lot in kind of those northern areas, or lentils as well, this will then kind of help break up that rotation and infection in your soil. Another really good thing about faba beans is they are really good at the nitrogen fixation. They're pretty much one of the top nitrogen fixing pulses. So it really is able to utilize all the biologicals in the soil and get that nitrogen fixation going. The other thing is high protein. So 27 to 35-ish% is pretty common for the different varieties of faba beans. So that is really good for going into the various different markets that I will be talking about. One of the big considerations, though, is all the increased breeding efforts that is going into the low vicine, convicine varieties. So this really is enabling farmers to be able to get into these kind of higher value markets for human consumption and ingredient use. And I will be talking more about that, just to kind of flesh it out a little bit. But that is just a nice overview of kind of what faba beans are doing for farmers. Here we have just some of the varieties that are available. Here I am just showing the low vicine, convicine varieties, because that is really the shift that we are looking to get in the market. Obviously, there are ones such as Snowbird that pretty much have the most acres in the country, but that does not have that low vicine, convicine trait. So we are trying to kind of pivot away from that a bit, but there is still a lot of opportunity for all these other different varieties. 60% of the faba beans grown in Saskatchewan are the low tannin type, which goes primarily to the feed market for various different livestock. And then there is the tannin variety that can be utilized more in the food market, and various other aspects. As I was saying about this low vicine, convicine, so what this really is that about 2.9% of the population is deficient in this G6PD molecule. And so what it does is when they ingest faba beans, it kind of triggers a rapid onset anemia, which can be fatal, but it's kind of like an allergy to it. So it's really kind of limits where the crop is able to go in different markets. This doesn't impact any of livestock feed or anything, but by having these low vicine, convicine varieties, it really just does increase the long-term access to these higher value markets where we can get into human consumption. And as we continue to see kind of the market increase globally, this is an aspect that really provides value to farmers to be able to tap into that high value market. One of the things to kind of recognize with this trait is faba beans in general. They are very prolific with their outcrossing. So if you're growing two different varieties side by side, they will uh, outcross with each other, kind of muddling the outcome of the crop. And that's the exact same with these varieties, where if you have a low vicine, convicine variety next to a normal or high vicine, convicine variety, they will outcross to each other, and you won't have that variety anymore as a low vicine. So how do you kind of get into establishing your faba beans? So they are very similar to peas in a lot of ways. The biggest thing is kind of they are a bigger seed than your normal pea would be. So that is one of the issues with kind of getting it through your air drill. That's just one thing to watch out for. But other than that, very, very similar and very easy to grow. They do deal very well with those cold, wet soil temperatures and conditions, so that you can kind of get these into the ground pretty early. At 5 degrees, they are fine going into that. You do definitely want to inoculate them, but again, like pea and lentil, they all use that Rhizobium leguminosarum, and so very easy to find different options there. That's a very common inoculant. One good thing about faba beans is they are very resistant and tolerant to applying fertilizer in row. Peas can be a little temperamental, so it's usually like 15 pounds of os seed placed, but like faba beans, they can tolerate up to 40 pounds per acre before emergence is affected by that FOS. So they are high utilizers of FOS, but they also can handle a lot in row to really kind of amp up their production. And then, yeah, again, with that low vicine, convicine, so minimum we suggest is a kilometer difference between it and any other variety of faba bean. Ideally, it would be closer to 2 to 5 kilometers just to preserve that trait, but it's kind of just depends on how far the bees are going to fly, because they are the primary way that the faba beans are kind of getting the job done. So here is just another kind of illustration to show the rotational options of why you should have that faba bean. This one really ties into that Aphanomyces. If growers have been doing peas and lentils for a long time, getting in a faba bean crop really does help reduce that strain on the system of having continual Aphanomyces growing, because it is mostly resistant. I can't say it's a non-host completely. It can be infected and release oomocytes to the soil, but not in a way that will kind of negatively impact the yield of the crop. And it is just a good alternative to other pulse crops in your rotation. Next, I'm just going to talk quickly about some key insects and diseases. So obviously, this being a pulse crop, it's impacted like a lot of the other ones with grasshoppers, pea leaf weevil, blister beetles, cutworms, wireworms, aphids. Those all can still impact the crop, but there are some good options for spraying those. I just want to focus today on the ligas. So this one is very damaging to faba beans, and you really need a very small amount of damage to impact the quality of the crop. So even 1% of damage downgrades the crop from a level 1 to a level 2. So it really can degrade what you've been growing for the whole season. But it acts the same as Flagus bug in any other crop like canola, where it has the little sucking mouth parts that will feed on the pods, penetrate the seeds. Here you can see it is just those little spots on the pods as it's been feeding, and really how it has degraded that quality of the seeds as they develop in the pods. When you're out scouting for these, like 7 to 10 lygus bugs per 25 sweeps, it is a very low number that can be really negatively impacting the crop. So you do want to be out there and scouting for that. Some of the diseases, so it is susceptible to chocolate spots, Staphylium, Alternaria. Best way to see this is to get out there scouting, looking at your crop throughout the year, early to late July, depending on the environmental conditions and how thick your crop is. All of these diseases kind of really thrive in that wet, humid environment. So if there's lots of leaf wetness, humidity, dew, all of that is going to kind of drive these diseases to be more impactful to the crop. There has also been some research coming out of the U of S where researchers were looking at faba bean fields to see if they were infected with chocolate spot, which is a detritus. But then when they take that to the lab, they actually can see that it is a Staphylium instead. And so you really do want to make sure that you are on top of scouting, because as we're seeing, things that we thought were chocolate spot, they might not be. That is just a very important thing to be on top of and be aware of. But again, really good fungicides and stuff that can be applied to combat these diseases if caught at appropriate times. As for harvesting, so really it's best to apply any kind of harvest aid at 30% moisture or less. If you're doing it at that time, 80% of the pods on the crop will have started to turn color, with the bottom 1/3 of the pods completely turned, and the seeds have changed color, are hard, and then the middle pods will have started to change and are a bit. When you break open a pod, the seeds themselves are quite hard to split in half, and the top pods will contain seeds that are firm, but they can be split in half pretty easily. So it is, as you can see here, kind of that normal gradient from the very mature on the bottom and the lesser on the top. Faba beans start to lose their leaves from the bottom up, and so in harvest aid, timing is usually associated with that 80 to 90% leaf drop when their leaves just kind of at the top of the plant and everything else has fallen away and those seeds are starting to dry up. And then lastly, for faba beans is the markets and end uses. So as you can see here, really the biggest markets that we are currently selling into are the United States and Egypt. They take the majority of our crops. We are always in competition with countries such as Australia and France. They're kind of the other two big producers of faba beans and do a lot of exporting. So that is one thing to be aware of. But as I was talking earlier, a lot of our faba beans go into that animal feed market. So those tannin containing faba beans, they're usually not put into that market, but the low tannin ones are for the hogs and the poultry and cattle. And we continue to look at because it is such a high protein crop that it really is a good option for including that into their feeding systems. Human consumption and pet food, those are two ones that we continue to develop. There are really just tons of work being put into how we can utilize faba beans the best. One of the biggest ones and kind of the highest priority right now is this fractionation, where we can break up the faba beans into kind of its different portions and aspects that can then be put to different markets. We have been talking a lot about kind of going into baked goods and snacks and pasta and animal or plant-based meat and dairy products. So it can be used for a lot of different ways of getting into the market. It is just a matter of kind of continuing to develop that portion of growing faba beans and why it is so beneficial. So with that, I will go into any questions that have been posted on Slido.
We'll just give it a minute here. I don't see any questions yet, Mark, but hang tight.
Yeah, so how tall can they get? This person's seen them in dry years when they were short, but heard them get pretty tall. Yeah, so I've seen some that are probably 4 feet tall, 5 feet, kind of waist height. They can, if they have, because they are so water dependent and really thrive under those conditions, if you have a very wet year, they can continue to just kind of get quite tall. Yeah, so any research on intercropping with another crop. So there is a lot of work going on there. I don't know if SPG is doing any specifically this year, but there have been quite a few reports put out. I believe we have them on our website. I can get back to you on that. But it is kind of really because they are so moisture loving that you do want to have it with a crop that is in the same zone that it would appreciate that. So do they lodge much? That is very much variety dependent and on the year. So if there are a couple, like they are more lodge resistant than peas for sure. They are able to stand up better than that. If you have this massive crop with all perfect conditions, it obviously will always kind of be a risk, but if you're comparing it directly to peas, it is much more able to stand up under its own weight. Non-host for Aphanomyces, but what about other roots? Yeah, so it is still susceptible to other root rots. We know in Saskatchewan, really, Aphanomyces is the most negatively impactful, especially because peas and lentils are the majority of the pulse acres in the province by a very large amount. So having that the soybeans and faba beans able to be fit into that rotation so that then peas and lentils can still be grown is kind of the important part of that resistance and being a non-host. So what do we see for production of fabas in East Central Sask? So From what I've heard from growers that I've been speaking to, it looks to be pretty kind of flat that the growers that are already growing faba beans continue to do so. Haven't seen a lot of new growers that are getting into the space. But yeah, it's kind of looking at also the conditions we're going into this year. It should be a pretty decent moisture um, seeding time, so fabas will enjoy that. As for actual acre numbers, I'm not sure. The market sheet for fava beans, where are they sold? Um, so off the top of my head, I am not sure. I know on the SPG website, you can go and see the various different buyers and sellers at the bottom of just the homepage. They'll have that. As for yeah, like the actual where they're sold, I don't know just right now, but on our website that is available. What are the biggest challenges of facing higher yields? Is it just lack of August rains or short season? Um, I would say for the most part, it is the length of the season that both faba beans and soybeans require. Typically, where faba beans are grown, they're pretty much good with the moisture, like they're going to get it year after year. So that's not the biggest challenge that they are facing in those areas. It is that it kind of can be a longer season crop, other than you can also put it in the ground earlier because it can handle those cooler temperatures.
What about an early frost at harvest time and beans aren't quite ready?
Yeah, so for both fabas and soybeans, they typically aren't too impacted from what I think I've read. I do know, again, on the SPG website, we have a document talking about late season frost for soybeans in particular. I know I've read, so I can point you uh, there. But I think from a quality standpoint, it's it's not too impactful. But don't quote me on that. I don't know off the top of my head.
We will gather up any relevant resources and include them in our post webinar email. So everyone attending today and everyone who is registered will receive a package shortly once the recording is ready. Any final takeaways you wanted to leave our audience with, Mark, before we wrap up?
No, I just want to thank everyone for joining. And here's all our information. Obviously, you can reach out to myself and Mike if you have any questions and want to chat about any of the crops that we've talked about for the last 2 days. And yeah, just kind of that's really it.